Hello, everyone. Good morning, and I guess good afternoon, depending on what part of the country you're listening to this webinar. But we are very excited to host this webinar, so thank you for joining us. Just as a reminder, please mute your line. That is *6 if you're on a landline or your cell phone. And what we thought about with this particular webinar is if you have questions, there's a chat function on the bottom left hand of your screen. Hit the bubble and you should be able to type in your questions. So our thought was, as we go through slides or information, should questions arise, feel free to type it into the chat function, and at the end I will take all questions and make sure that we ask our presenters today those questions, and we can kind of go from there. So thanks again. We're really excited. Like we said, we've been working on this for a few months. So with that being said, let's get some of the introductions taken care of. We've Medix's own Molly Donauer. She helps sites across the U.S. with a variety of different functions, from operations, compliance, and some other things. We also have Patricia Shannon joining us from Pinnacleinancial Oncology and Hematology. So we're privileged to have her part of the team in presenting today. And then myself, Dan Dummeroff, which will be the moderator, so I'll be keeping the things flowing. Quick disclaimer. This webinar is not sponsored by any CTMS systems. Our pure purpose is to empower sites and advance research through shared knowledge and experience. It was really important for us to make sure that this was based on pure education. We want to make sure that sites got some really good information from this, so that we could put it into practice as soon as possible.
Thanks, Dan. This in-service is for the end user, and that may be a CRC, a CRN, or another title in clinical research. I do want to make sure that you all are aware that when we did the literature search, the only thing that was available to us was focused on the conflict scenes between nurses and finance. And I believe that's because there are so many different titles in clinical research that there wasn't one thing that was uniform in order to do research on.
Yeah, that's a good point, because a lot of the sites that we work with across the U.S., either they don't have CRNs or they call their nurses CRCs. So throughout this webinar, we use the term, whether it be CRN or CRC, kind of as the same term. So whether you're a coordinator or you're a nurse, it's really still applicable.
Absolutely. The process can be applied.
So let's dig in, Molly.
All right. So these are the 4 main reasons why your research administrator has purchased a CTMS system. They want to increase revenue by real-time financial activity tracking, increase operational efficiencies and protocol compliance, and centralization of all documents. 2 through 4 are all great reasons to invest in a CTMS, but there are other tools out there to help as well. The number 1 reason for investing into a CTMS is the increased revenue by real-time financial activity tracking.
And that's an interesting point, but after some conversations with some other folks, I guess why aren't we seeing the immediate return on investment when we implement a CTMS?
There are a lot of different answers to that question, Dan. But we're going to focus on this one for this webinar, the lack of engagement with staff. So I'd like to start with a story. Pat and I are former clinical research nurses. We are cut from the same cloth and had the same philosophy towards a relationship between nursing and finance, aka there really shouldn't be one. But healthcare is changing, and with change is an opportunity to learn. As our roles evolved, we learned that the negative impact of end users of not having knowledge in connection to finance was really bad. Pat?
And we also learned that as coordinators, we had the most information on what occurred with our patients. Underreporting what we did financially stressed out our sites. Lack of data entry into the CTMS or communication to our finance team gave decision makers inaccurate information to base decisions. Delays in payments resulted in delays in being able to hire additional staff. And at the most extreme, lack of or incomplete data entry put the site at risk of closing, thereby putting our patients at risk. It is definitely a downstream effect, to say the least.
Yeah, I guess when I first heard it, I saw the huge impact that it had at the site level. But the more you guys have kind of spoke about it, it seems like we're putting the patients at risk. There's consequences for the patient. So, I mean, it's still not a coordinator problem, or?
Initially, Pat and I felt it was really the research administrators or the finance team's problem. It wasn't at the coordinator level.
No, definitely not.
So I would assume that, we've tried a few different issues to, fix this. So can you kind of go into a few things of what maybe we've already tried?
Absolutely. I like to call these Band-Aids. Band-Aids that we have tried: less expensive employees, financial employees entering the data, or simply my favorite, going back to paper.
So, being in the talent industry, I don't really know what you mean by less expensive employees.
So this is, CRCs and CRNs are probably next to your PIs, your largest expense in the budget. So looking at less expensive employees like research assistants or nursing assistants, medical assistants, some other employee who could follow the CRCs around and convey the information from the front line to the financial team. I personally follow the lean methodology where the person doing the work documents it. Why would you put in a middleman who could potentially document something inaccurately and then create the extra work of having to go back and QA it to make sure it's accurate?
So I guess the idea was to essentially free up the CRN or CRC by adding an MA to try to get some of the documentation, but unfortunately some of the data was just either corrupt or not getting entered in the right way.
Absolutely, and then you just have the extra work of ensuring that it is correct.
Okay. So a theory was good, it just didn't end up being probably the best type of scenario.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And the same holds true if you're using just financial employees, because they don't always fully comprehend the nuances of clinical activity. They may miss invoiceables or other not straightforward clinical research activities. And this often leads, again, to having the clinical team review the entry into the CTMS for clinical accuracy. And of course, our favorite, because we're nurses, go back to paper. Well, the information still has to get from the front line to the financial team. And what happens if that paper gets lost? What if the end user doesn't document the information correctly on the paper? For example, if a scheduled visit turns out to be an end-of-treatment visit and that information isn't written on that paper or communicated accurately, the wrong information gets put into the CTMS on the back end. And who's going to QA that data? Now you're losing the other valuable features of the CTMS when you're having to go back and repeat things that should only be done once.
Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't necessarily think paper was an option with today's technology, but it's definitely time-consuming as well. So, okay, well let's start digging into some learning objectives.
Great. Learning objective number 1: understand why end users, often CRNs, CRCs, disassociate themselves with the CTMS. And then number 2, to detail a plan to engage or re-engage the end user.
I think when Molly and I were preparing for the webinar, one of my immediate questions was, hey Molly, why do we have to really even cover point 1? Why not just go straight to point 2 and let's just get a detailed plan rolling?
Dan, you're always looking for the quick and easy, but it's a fact that all webinars need at least 2 points. In all seriousness, you need to understand the why before you can move on to the how.
All right, so then I guess at the root cause, why is it so important then for the end users? Why is it so important to know why the end users are disassociating themselves with the CTMS at the end of the day?
The process starts when administrators look into buying the CTMS system. They may include the end user in the CTMS selection, but they often overlook the rationale why it is needed in the first place. So therefore, the staff needs to understand the rationale, and then administrators need to acknowledge their hesitancies and validate any potential concerns before they move on. So studies show that the majority of nurses recognize the importance of financial sustainability in healthcare, including the importance of revenue capture, cost containment, the change to value-based payments, and decreased reimbursements by Medicare and insurance companies.
So it seems like there's a basic understanding. It seems like they somewhat get it. So I guess, Pat, why the gap? What's the problem?
So the research tells us that nurses feel that financial solvency conflicts with their role as a caregiver and patient advocate. Nurses feel a lack of ownership of organizational financial performance, despite often being the largest part of the overall budget. Nurses typically are not trained in nursing school or even on the job in the financial aspects of their department. A perfect example of this is when nurses give supplies to patients without regard to the downstream effects.
It's like the heart's in the right place, but they're not realizing the impact on the organization.
That's a good point. So I guess, what do we do from here, Molly?
Let's move on to the plan. Learning objective number 2. If you've already implemented your CTMS system, it's time to hit the restart button. If you're just starting, then this is the plan that I recommend to go with. And I prefer using Lewin's change theory. So first we're going to assess the root causes for your lack of engagement with staff. Then we're going to dispel the status quo. We're going to give them the tools to change. And finally, we make it our new normal. So assessing the root causes for lack of engagement with your staff. Pat, what were some of your initial feelings with the CTMS?
It certainly was horrifying. My initial thought was, this isn't my job, and it stressed me out. And for a while, I just ignored it, thinking it would go away. But ultimately, it was my responsibility, and it didn't go away.
I think if you do a deeper dive with your staff, things you may hear are, I did not go into nursing school to have to deal with financial responsibilities. Doing anything financial conflicts with my role as a caregiver. I don't understand research finances or financial terms. Or, geez, I thought I understood them, but maybe I really don't.
Yeah. So I think we got to the bottom of, some of the reasons why there's a disconnect. But, at the crux of this, why is the CTMS so important, Molly?
Because clinical research typically runs on a reimbursement financial system. That means the site pays for all of the services up front, except for the services that are charged to the insurance companies. And then they submit the activity for reimbursement and hopefully some revenue from the sponsor. The CTMS is your tracking system to accurately account for all activity to submit to the sponsor.
So I guess, when we look at the sponsor, we feel like the sponsors and the CROs and the sites, right, they're all interdependent of each other. So I would argue that the CROs and the sponsors probably have the most financial backing, but at the time, these sites are fronting a lot of this money. Is that correct? And
correct.
If so, how much is kind of outstanding at any given point?
That's correct, Dan. It really depends on how much research each individual site does. So a small site that just does a little bit of research could be fronting a couple of $1,000s to a large research site that could be fronting hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars.
So then the question would be if you do have a CTMS at your site and you're not necessarily logging the data correctly, what's the potential for loss there at that point?
The potential for loss is huge. And this is obviously not financially stable. And in some cases, it can also jeopardize your legal standing of the organization. So for example, if you're a not-for-profit site and you are now essentially subsidizing the for-profit research company, then you could jeopardize the legal standing of your not-for-profit status.
Okay.
Yeah, and the same holds true. We still have to pay our bills at the site level and run our business. Even further stressing the cash flow of sites is the fact that many sponsor contracts are set up for quarterly payments. Even in the best case scenario of monthly payments, it is still a month behind the site fronting the expenses of the research. In some cases, it can be as long as 6 months before the site gets paid. You can't run your business that way.
Yeah, it's interesting because we want to make sure that all the work that we're doing as healthcare and clinical research professionals, it gets accounted for. So it's an interesting take to where a business kind of meets the research side of things.
Absolutely. And clinical research is definitely in the business to help patients in advanced science. But as they say, no money, no mission.
All right. So, I think we talked about, obviously why it's so important. But I guess why is the data entry then? And we talked about this a little bit in the Band-Aid portion. But why is the data entry into the CTMS the end user's responsibility?
I think we need a reality check here, Dan, because everyone is responsible for the financial solvency of the organization. Across healthcare and all other professions, all employees are stakeholders in the financial health. If you're not doing your part, what value do you bring to the organization? And you are a stakeholder because you want to continue to do research for your patients, and honestly, you want to continue to be employed.
Yeah.
That's right. And as the clinical research nurse or the CRC, we have the most information on the clinical activity that's been completed. And like all healthcare documentation, if you don't document it, it wasn't done. And if it wasn't documented in the CTMS, we don't get paid.
You know, when I was transitioning from a research nurse to a research administrator, now doing the budgets, I quickly learned that I could identify costs that were not obvious in the protocols, like additional time, supplies, or personnel that were needed for assessments. So I was able to add value by becoming involved in translating this into financial revenue for our site.
Yeah, and I think, the next slide will, kind of speak even more to it. But again, it's kind of connecting the accountability and the passion of what we're doing on a day-to-day basis.
So for our final point is dispelling the status quo. I'm going to proactively apologize for getting really passionate here, but this hits at my core. In fact, I'm going to read this as I might get a little choked up. The CTMS empowers you to be both a caregiver and a revenue generator. Most nursing expenses are rolled into housekeeping or other procedural costs. However, clinical research is different. It recognizes the work the clinical research nurse does, both professionally and technically, as physicians and other professionals. The clinical research industry recognizes that the clinical research nurses and CRCs need to be experts in the protocol and the disease while carrying out the schedule of events in the protocol. The CTMS is the mechanism to acknowledge these well-deserved efforts financially. It is an empowerment tool that needs to be used to generate data on the financial value of CRNs and CRCs, caring for our communities and advancing science. Don't you and your organization deserve to be recognized for the hard work you do?
Yeah, I think that's well said. I think the 2 points that hit home for me, Molly, was the point you have, it's a mechanism to acknowledge the well-deserved efforts. We work with a lot of CRCs or CRNs across the U.S., and I think it's hard to do this job, and there's so much time and effort that you're putting into it, and sometimes the efforts aren't necessarily recognized. And I think the CTMS, although it may be there for a business, I think it also puts some recognition on the work that we do and saying, hey, we're bringing this in for our site. We're able to fund more research because we're being fiscally responsible. So I think there's some secondary outcomes here that when you said that, it kind of hits home for me. And then the second piece was the empowerment tool. I think this gives us, our sites across the U.S., a huge opportunity to advance that research and empower what we're doing. So, with that being said, I think it's a perfect segue into our next slide, Pat, or Molly, with some tools to change.
Absolutely. So first we need to learn the lingo. What are invoiceables? What is overhead? Standard of care charges, research charges. Then we need to take it a step further and really understand what these terms mean at your site. Research charge. Does it mean we charge it to the sponsor, or is it just part of the research protocol? Unfortunately, there's not always standardizations with these terms, so let's really dig down and understand what they mean. And then step 3, we need a baseline clinical finance training. As I mentioned, this is a reimbursement system, aka we start in the red and then we have to move to the black.
Right, and the more you talk about it, the less threatening it will be. In order to talk about it, the staff need to see and review the information. Staff can provide input into what can improve the clinical trial budget. At our institution, we have a protocol review meeting which involves all of the parties involved in the protocol, so regulatory affairs, budget and contract, finance, pharmacy, nursing, and data management. And each department reviews their pieces of the protocol to decide not only if the protocol is feasible, but is it fiscally sound. And I understand that at my site, we're very lucky to have all of these different departments, but at some places it's only 1 or 2 people that have to make all these decisions.
Yeah, that's a good point. So Molly, what type of opportunities are out there for education?
So, You can attend a clinical trials conference. There are national conferences that you can attend, boot camps, and I always learn new information when I invest in an educational opportunity, whether it be a best practice or a new approach to a problem. You can attend webinars, such as this from our handsome Dan Dummeroff.
They must have snuck that picture in.
Or you can bring in a consultant like this one on your screen. This one looks particularly smart, and I highly recommend her. But seriously, staff tend to stick to educational opportunities in their comfort zone, so I really encourage leaders to push them to expand their knowledge.
Yeah, I think one of the hard things in business in general is taking that education to execution. Pat, can you kind of talk to us about some of that?
Sure. I think it's important also at this time to remember that you're not in this alone. It's better to ask a question and understand the process than to either ignore it or do it incorrectly. So let's talk about the new normal. Some of the tools that we recommend are an orientation program, and then go from that to doing daily activities and then doing a regular review. Nursing schools are charged with cramming a lot of information in a short period of time. It may not be feasible for them to incorporate healthcare finance into their curriculums. Add to that equation the fact that research is a whole different scenario with its own unique challenges. Organizations have the burden of training on the job. It can be difficult to include clinical trial finances in their organizational program. If you were able to provide that type of training up front, misconceptions like, well, if the insurance doesn't cover the charge, we can just bill it to the sponsor, can be alleviated.
Yeah, so Molly, we talked about opportunities for education. Pat just mentioned some of the ways to implement it into our daily process, but how do we take it to the next level?
So once you have the fundamental financial knowledge, then we really can take it to the next level of creating a culture of ownership of your financial performance. And the best part is that this is all supported by your CTMS system. So you can have these, as Pat mentioned, these regular reviews and use the transparency of your financial reports in these discussions. And these discussions can then be based on data, not emotions.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. And I think it's one thing to kind of talk about it, but then another thing to kind of hear a little bit of a case study. So again, we've had the privilege of Pat coming in here, and she's going to share a little bit of a case study and success story with us.
Thank you, Dan. When our community-based practice began about 10 years ago, our research billing was actually done out of state. And at the time, they were not using a CTMS program. Everything was done on paper and spreadsheets. There were delays in getting invoices to the sponsors, and to my knowledge, there wasn't a reconciliation process in place. In retrospect, I think the research billing was done rather blindly. In addition, the process was not clearly explained to the nurses. There were many charges that were missed and some things that were billed to the sponsor that were never completed. Revenue was always behind, and I held on to the notion that it was more of an administrator's concern than a nursing problem. When we finally moved to in-house research billing, budgets, and contracts, there was a long reconciliation process. There was one person responsible for it all, and she was awesome at it. She used an Excel spreadsheet for each of the studies based on the budget and schedule of events. She had everything color-coded to help her quickly see where everything was in the process. She communicated with the nurses, and the invoices were sent in a timely manner. Unfortunately, she suddenly passed away, and we had to start again from scratch and figure out where everything was. When her replacement was hired, we began using a CTMS program, and we initially just used it for real-time regulatory documents and informed consents. As our budget and contract department became more familiar with the program, the specific study visits were built into the CTMS program. This includes any invoiceable items such as pregnancy tests or CT scans, and it was just in the last 6 months that our nurses have been entering visits into the CTMS program. Needless to say, when the nurses were first approached with this new concept of entering visits into the system, it was not well received. The nurses were the first ones to say, "We don't have time, that's really not my job," and pretty much every other excuse that we've already touched on here. There was not a clear explanation at the beginning as to why we had to do this. Again, the major disconnect from I am a patient advocate, not a billing person. but with background fundamental knowledge of clinical trial finances and practices with the CTMS, we were eventually able to make it our norm. I can say that once we started entering the visit, it was empowering. As a CRN, I always feel like I'm making a difference in the lives of my patients. Now I feel like I play a larger role for the betterment of my company. We enter the visits, the charges are verified by our finance team, the invoices are sent to the sponsors in a timely manner. It's not perfect, and it definitely is a learning process because we still have a long way to go. But the key is communication on everyone's part, and with a little extra work, it is well worth the effort.
Thank you so much for sharing. I think, the cool thing about that, case study or success story, if you will, is it illustrates, no site is perfect out there. We're going to make mistakes. And there's no shortage of challenges either in implementing or effectively utilizing, a CTMS. I think, as I reflect back on the conversations today, I think the first issue is making sure that we have a clear communication, line of open to the staff and making sure that they understand why. I think, Molly, I think it was in another session that you said they're often, kind of brought in to pick out a CTMS sometimes or evaluate it, but not necessarily understanding, the reasons behind it. So, it kind of concludes, our session today. It was really important for us to stay right around 30 minutes. We know that, everyone on this call is extremely busy. I've got some questions that were emailed to me that I'd like to ask you guys throughout the course, and we're probably going to have a few pop up here on our chat function as well. But thanks again, really appreciate it. One of the questions that came through was, and it's for either of you, who is responsible for the training of the staff, either on the CTMS or on the financial side?
I'll take that, Pat, if that's okay. I feel that as a clinical research professional, it is always in your best interest to take on any kind of training that is going to make you more hireable and a better employee, and any sort of educational offering will only enhance you and make you that much better. Aside from that, I think it's also a partnership between the leadership team, whether that's the PI or you have research administration, and the finance team. It needs to be a collaboration on everyone's part, because ultimately you want to have the same language from your staff to your finance team to be able to communicate and accurately bill.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Pat. I don't know if there's anything that you want to add there.
No, Molly pretty much hit the nail on the head. Communication is the key, and as long as everybody is speaking the same language and on the same page, everybody understands where they're supposed to be in the process.
Yeah, and actually another question that popped up, so I assume that you didn't necessarily start thinking that way. So I guess, the question that popped up was, what was the pivotal point in seeing the value in the CTMS system?
I'm a nurse at heart, and so I certainly did not think that finance would be anything that I would be interested in or necessarily even good at. But when I was a research administrator, I was put in a position where I could see that my team was struggling. They needed more help. We had a large volume of patients. We had a large volume of research, and I needed to add more staff. On the flip side, when I went and I was looking at our finances, we were uncovered all this money that wasn't entered into the CTMS that was essentially just left on the table. And so I couldn't justify hiring more staff when I didn't have the cash flow. So I was put in a really bad position. And so it was really important that I, hit the restart button, go back and train the staff, because, maybe that was my error, that I didn't communicate the why behind the CTMS.
Yeah, and I guess that's, looking back at it, certainly had to be frustrating, but I would imagine a good transformation nonetheless. Pat, is there anything that you want to add there?
Actually, something that just popped into my head is that our finance team are not nurses, and it's important for the nurses to be able to have a part in that budget building portion of the contract, because what we do is very important, and there are a lot of, like we said before, nuances that people who don't work on the front line don't understand. For instance, at our site, we consent our patients, which can take up to several hours, sometimes depending on the complexity of the consent form, and we don't necessarily get, quote unquote, paid for that. it's just kind of rolled up into the budget. But with the understanding between the nurses and the finance team, we can build that into the budget. So those types of costs are captured.
I think in fairness to the finance team, there's really great finance teams that are out there, but in typical finance, it's very linear and straightforward. But in research, depending on how the contracts are built, perhaps you only are able to bill for 3 screen fails out of 5 enrolled. So there has to be that communication back and forth because it's not just straight entry, click and bill.
Yeah, it's an interesting perspective, and I think as you guys gain the experience over the years, your perspective is really valuable because I think a lot of the folks at the site level are struggling with some of these things. So again, I can't thank you enough for being part of this. This was really important to Medix. I think as we've met so many really cool CRCs and CRNs and some research staff, everyone is so passionate about doing some things. So I think we all either have family members or we have friends out there that could benefit from some of the advancing research that we're doing. It looks like another question that just popped up was the new norm. What were the components of that? Molly, do you want to just review that real quick?
Sure. In review, making it the new normal was the step 1, including it as a part of your orientation program. Step 2, making it part of your daily activities rather than an afterthought. And step 3, as Pat mentioned, regular review of the clinical trial finances.
So I think that really concludes it. To wrap this up, thank you all for attending. We really appreciate it. You'll be hearing via email from a Medix employee or myself with the slide deck that we'll get this emailed out to you, and then by early next week we'll be able to have an audio function sent out to you as well. We're going to have additional webinars that are coming up throughout the course of the year, so stay tuned. Hopefully you all found this valuable, and if there's any feedback, certainly don't hesitate to reach out. But again, Molly, Pat, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. And that's it. Thanks everyone for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you.